Persona is one of the most beloved gaming series today, and it's easy to see why. From its unique blend of social simulation and dungeon crawling to its quirky characters, Persona has earned its spot at the top. While I don't always gravitate towards the games, I have to admit, I have a good time playing them. Well, most of the time. But I've always wondered, how did this series, which now sits on such a high pedestal, evolve into what we know today? In my recent video on Shin Megami Tensei If, I talked a bit about how it laid some of the early groundwork that would eventually lead to the first Persona game. And in today's video, we'll be diving into that very first game, Revelations Persona, or for some, Persona 1. Exploring how it helped set the stage for Persona's success and see how it stacks up against the rest of the Megami Tensei games. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe and leave a like, and I'll forever be at your service. Revelations Persona first launched in 1996 in Japan and was released a year later in North America on the PlayStation. It aimed to shift away from some of the more controversial themes found in Shin Megami Tensei, instead focusing on a character-driven story with supernatural elements. A few of its core pieces would be borrowed from Shin Megami Tensei If, in particular the high school setting and the introduction of personas, a modernized take on the Guardian system. This would help blend its traditional dungeon crawling and turn-based combat with its stronger focus on dialogue and individual characters. At its time, the game was fairly well received, with its concepts, themes, and gameplay laying down the foundation for what would become one of Atlus's biggest franchises, spawning sequels, spin-offs, and even anime and manga adaptations. A remaster for the PSP was later released in 2009, featuring updated visuals, voice acting, and a much cleaner interface. And this is the version I chose to play for this review. And after checking out the original PS1 release and doing some research, I'm glad I went with this version of the game. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that although this may be a Persona game, this is still Persona in its infancy. A lot of its inspiration still derives directly from Shin Megami Tensei, which should be obvious. I mean, it is a Shin Megami Tensei spin-off. That said, Persona 1 does create its own identity and style, sometimes working in its favor, while other times it doesn't. Its often unbalanced presentation, overcomplicated gameplay mechanics, and confusing and sluggish navigation are hard to ignore. But being the first game to a new series, there's going to be some trial and error, with these missteps more so showcasing an ambition and unique charm that ultimately led to a bad beginning but legendary start for the Persona series. This also doesn't mean the game doesn't have any strong points, because it does. And though the game is relatively short, I found there to be a surprising amount to unpack here. The introduction of the Persona system added a new layer to combat, while its tone, atmosphere, and psychological themes explored larger, more thought-provoking questions. On top of that, its OST and art direction established a distinct, stylish identity that would continue defining future Persona games. For me though, Persona 1 really drew me in right away with its original setup and memorable characters that set the tone for its engaging dialogue and world building, despite feeling unpolished at times. The game opens up with the protagonist and his classmates passing time by playing a game called Persona, which supposedly lets you communicate with other entities. And though we're at the very opening moments, I think the game starts off on a really strong note here. What stands out to me isn't just the distinct designs, personalities, and backgrounds of the characters, but the bond between them. It's just friends being friends, making it easy to connect with them and drawing you in right away. Moments after completing the ritual, a ghostly figure appears, causing several members of the group to suddenly collapse. While unconscious, the protagonist is transported to a dreamlike realm where he's granted the power of Persona by Philemon, a mysterious figure who warns that this power will soon be needed. After recovering, the group heads to the local hospital to check in on Maki, another classmate who's been sick for several months. During the visit, Maki's room and a part of the hospital mysteriously vanish, and demons begin appearing throughout the town. From there, the group must awaken their newfound Persona abilities and uncover what exactly is going on. Now, shortly after this point, the game splits into two separate storylines. For this review, I'll primarily be covering the Sebek storyline, the version most considered to be the stronger of the two. I'll still highlight points from the Snow Queen storyline where relevant, but I believe it deserves its own dedicated analysis outside of this ranking series. Persona 1's narrative, characters, and dialogue all carry bold ideas, and it's easy to see how they shape the series' identity. The game is clearly trying to dig into something deeper than just another story about saving the world, which is worth praising. That said, while that vision sets up a compelling concept, its execution and follow-through feel scattered, leaving a lot to be desired. Still, even with the amount of wasted potential, I genuinely enjoy a lot of what the game does offer, especially once it begins leaning into the weird psychological direction that sets its story apart. With this taking place after a healthy Maki appears right in front of you, and the group uncovering the cause of the demon outbreak, tracing it back to the director of Sebek, Kandori, and the activation of the Diva system. After confronting him, a mysterious girl named Aki appears and pulls you into an alternate reality, shifting the tone entirely. You notice people are missing, personalities have changed, and buildings have completely vanished. Soon after, it's revealed by Yosuke, a classmate and test subject of the Diva system, that this is an alternate version of Maki. It's here where her character not only becomes the central figure of the plot, but many of the game's themes, such as one's identity, escapism, and trauma. Themes that also extend to Kandori himself too, both pushing a narrative that the trauma one experiences can change the perspective of the world around you. And in this case, it isn't just Maki and Kandori having to deal with it, but everyone around them. However, the moments that actually highlight these ideas are pretty thin, and the game fails to use Maki as a way to explore the struggles of others. Outside of Maki, the only other characters who see a meaningful arc are Yosuke and Chisato, characters who aren't main party members. With both being stranded in this new world, Chisato ends up serving under Kandori after being gifted with the Black Mirror, allowing her to make any wish she desires come true. However, for each wish granted, a mole appears on her face, representing her internal corruption driven by jealousy, guilt, and insecurity of being in Maki's shadow, with these being issues and emotions that most can probably relate to, though their actions are hopefully to a much lesser degree. What makes this part stand out is that unlike the other obstacles standing between you and Kandori, this isn't just another boss fight, it's someone you know, and you're forced to address the reason behind these actions. We also see Yosuke's involvement with his acceptance of Chisato add another layer to this moment as well, being one of, if not the only time where the game truly leans into the personal dilemma of a character, and showing a glimpse of what Persona 1 could be when it's willing to explore its characters more. This brings me to the rest of the characters and dialogue in the game. Similar to the plot so far, there's a lot I actually do enjoy here. The designs, personalities, and bond between your party were something that immediately pulled me into the game, while their quirky, relatable interactions kept me engaged. There's a clear distinction between everyone early on to make them feel like their own person, even with the very minor support characters. And I think this distinction is what kept me so invested in the game. However, this isn't always used to its advantage, and I can't think of any better example than when it actually comes to your party. While their company is welcomed, there were times where they feel like they're just physically there and mentally somewhere else. I know they're just video game characters and it's a weird way to express it, but I'm sure you get what I mean. The game does use the party's interaction to help move the story along sometimes, which is nice, and we see their personalities on full display here. But it doesn't really go much deeper than that. We don't get to see much about their backgrounds, and there's not a lot of real character growth. And to me, this feels like something that could have been done without taking too much extra work. Even just a few more scenes or lines could have helped make the group feel more complete. And I find this issue stemming from the game's approach to recruiting your 5th party member. Though there are merits to this, these are also met with a handful of setbacks. Setbacks that give me flashbacks to Shin Megami Tensei If, since the game doesn't give you any information that the character you recruit is locked or how many there are. And this results in nearly half the group being off screen after this stage, with their absence stripping away the charm that originally drew me into the game so quick, also missing out on potential dialogue, character-driven moments, and a better understanding of the group's background. Additionally, the characters that are on screen barely show any major growth. Personally, I think having dedicated arcs for the characters you don't recruit, even if short, could address both these issues, being a good substitute for the locked party members while bringing some development to the ones not recruited. I should stress that despite my issues with how the game handled their development and taking others off screen, I still think they're great additions overall. Plus, the Snow Queen storyline puts a bigger focus on specific characters, letting you see them a bit more. But I wish the game would utilize them to their potential because there's so much here. Which could also be said for Kandori, who, while doing a great job being a bad guy and getting you to hate him, feels hollow and isn't the best antagonist in my eyes. It's easy to point out the few shared themes between him and Maki, both touching on escapism, as Kandori uses the Diva system to reshape the world into his own vision. But beyond this, we don't actually know or learn that much about him. He's barely on screen and the game misses opportunities to develop him further, which is rather unfortunate as I thought the game's early stages set him up to be an interesting villain, and one that could have a stronger on-screen role instead of being hidden away. Though there are moments where other characters like Aki and Chisato are used in his place, these don't make up for his absence, only highlighting that he's the bad guy of the game, something we should all know by his introduction. By the time everything comes full circle, Kandori's final resolution doesn't really have the payoff I was hoping for. Even the brief exchange with Nancho to clarify his motives all feels rushed. I know the Persona manga highlights his backstory more, but in the game itself, I felt like I was still being introduced to him by the time of his final appearance. And for a character so significant to the narrative, he never ends up feeling like a fully realized antagonist. With this in mind, this lack of clarity also extends to the dialogue selection and its impact on how the endings are handled in Persona 1. In addition to the game's 2 separate storylines, each one also features multiple endings, something pretty standard for classic Mega 10 games. As for the Snow Queen storyline, I haven't fully explored it yet, so I'm holding off sharing my full thoughts until a future video. What I will say though is that the way both storylines and their endings are presented to the player is pretty unclear, which feels especially true for the Sebek route, as several key dialogue choices throughout the game determine which of the 2 endings you'll get. On its own, this isn't necessarily a bad thing, and I've always enjoyed this type of interactive style of gameplay. The problem is there's no real indication of what those choices mean. The game doesn't give you any sense of which option leads to the good ending and which one leads to the bad one. Some of the choices seem rather obvious, but others feel like either answer is fine, making it feel like your decision doesn't really matter. And without a guide, I wouldn't be surprised if a number of people ended up with a weaker, more confusing ending, which to me is a shame because the game builds up such a strong concept. And despite the issues with it fully utilizing its characters and themes to their potential, had it wrapped up nicely, Persona 1 may be discussed in a higher regard today. With that said, while I find the story starting things off on a strong note, building interest in its characters, themes, and the direction things can go, it often feels uncommitted to them. Despite these criticisms and many what-ifs, I still enjoyed what the game had to offer here though. And really, I think modern standards makes it easy to forget how experimental and revolutionary these parts of the game were for its time. Even if they didn't quite land, they did manage to leave their mark, essentially laying the groundwork for what Persona would become. Once you get into the core gameplay, however, this is where many of the more noticeable problems start to surface, and where some of my strongest opinions about Persona 1 come from. Now, don't get me wrong, there are a lot of great ideas here, and I can see what the game was aiming for. There's a ton of customization when it comes to the party arrangement and recruitable characters, the variety of personas adds a tactical balance, and the spell card system changes the dynamic up for fusion and recruiting quite a bit. At the time of its release, all of these felt fresh and ambitious. But the problem is, everything, even the good stuff, feels needlessly overcomplicated. Almost every system is layered in a way that makes the basic commands feel clunky or like the game is working against you. This is especially true when it comes to the combat and party mechanics, which try to switch up the formula a bit, but ultimately struggle under their own changes. In the case of combat, I don't think it's as bad as others might say, but it's definitely not pretty. And honestly, this is the worst combat system from a Persona game I played so far. The game still utilizes a turn-based system with standard options like physical attacks, skills, and guns all available as you go back and forth with your enemy. However, Persona 1 sets itself apart from other Megaten titles with a distinctly different, often frustrating approach to combat, as battles take place on an isometric grid-based field divided into tiles, with each party member's placement playing a major role. Each character occupies a specific tile, with their attack range depending on their weapon type and position on the grid. While this is a neat idea that incorporates some strategy, it also introduces some limitations that drag combat down. Since characters like Maki, who use a bow, can hit targets on any tile, while others like Mark can only hit directly in front of them. And what makes this so frustrating is that certain characters often have no valid targets because of the way range works in the game. This leaves certain members just standing there doing nothing while others handle all the work. Though taking out enemies in the front row will shift those in the back forward, creating some new openings, and you can change formation mid-battle, these don't feel like the best trade-offs. To make things worse, you'll notice a pretty high encounter rate and the enemy's love for using status effect attacks on you, impacting the pacing of not only battles, but the entire game. And while options like gun-based attacks and spells do reach out further, these also have restrictions at times. Factoring in that many enemies resist or null guns, it doesn't fully offset the problems with the grid-based system. Now, despite all of this, the introduction of personas is one area that I think the game handles pretty well. I know the execution isn't fully here either, but I think it fits nicely with the rest of the combat's mechanical shifts. Compared to modern Persona games, personas function much differently here, but you'll still see the foundation of what they would eventually become. Each party member is able to summon their own persona in battle, and this does help with some of the frustrations from the grid-based system, especially since each persona has its own spell list and stat influence. What I specifically find unique here is that summoning a persona costs a flat amount of SP, meaning no matter which spell you use, it will always cost the same for that persona, adding a balance to resource management while also letting you spam powerful spells in some cases. Given my issues so far, this is viewed as a good thing. That said, this isn't something you could take for granted. As one would expect, stronger personas will have a higher SP cost, while the weaker ones will be lower. Depending on the persona, you may find yourself burning through your SP within 1 or 2 battles, so you'll still need to manage it wisely. Additionally, unlike modern Persona games, personas don't level up here. Instead, they'll rank up over time as they're summoned during battles, with a max rank of 8. And unlike other Megaten games for this time, this feels like the game is rewarding the player for staying loyal to Persona, while also giving the flexibility to experiment through fusion and negotiations, which we'll touch on in a bit. Personally, this is something that I found really refreshing, as it broke the mold found in other games like Shin Megami Tensei 1, 2, If, and Soul Hackers. Games that focus solely on upgrading your party through recruiting and fusion. With that in mind, I also found the ability to change every member's persona a nice touch. As here, none of the characters have any strengths, resistances, or weaknesses, but instead are all inherited from their personas. While this can be advantageous for you, it doesn't mean that you'll be able to make an overpowered party, as some characters naturally align better with certain persona based on their affinity. Choosing a persona that doesn't match well can mean spells miss more often or don't land at all. Fortunately, the game will highlight whether a persona is a good match or not, so you aren't left in the dark, making it pretty easy to build a party to at least overcome some of the curves you'll face in combat. Unfortunately, while I find personas to be great and the rest of combat to at least show some ambition, both are crippled by how experience and leveling up work in the game. Rather than distributing experience evenly across the group, or more to lower level members, Persona 1 rewards characters who deal major damage or land the final blow. And since turns are based on the agility stat and it isn't too difficult to take out enemies in 1 or 2 hits, 1 or 2 party members are likely to be underleveled. You can try and fix this by assigning a persona with a high agility stat to a lower leveled member so they can at least attack first, but often this isn't always an available option, especially if those personas are a higher level than your persona level. Not your character level, their persona level, which is also different from a persona's rank. Yeah, I don't really understand why this game had so many different leveling systems. This forces you into having some party members guard while others attack, or running a smaller team by letting others die, neither being ideal situations. Honestly, I feel like the game is punishing me for playing it exactly how it's designed, and ultimately this flawed experience system overshadows the introduction of personas, which should have been the highlight of the entire game. While the persona mechanics are solid and add some freshness to combat, they feel smothered by the restrictions of the grid system, experience imbalance, and the weird leveling systems. Still though, for all of its problems, Persona 1's combat is definitely unique, but riddled with issues. There are a lot of fun moments and strategic layers behind it, but you have to work harder than you should to find them. And it is somewhat manageable if you're patient enough in my opinion. Fortunately, other aspects of its gameplay make up for this, despite my initial reservations. Now, if there's one thing I consistently find the Persona games to trip up on, it's the recruiting and negotiation systems. And Persona 1 is no exception here, but I find it to be extremely unique and oddly enjoyable. And despite some of the issues so far, the game starts to redeem itself once its demon negotiation and fusion systems come into play. There's clearly some trial and error going on here, but it mostly works in a game's favor, as instead of recruiting personas to join your party, you're negotiating for their spell cards, and then using those to fuse for new personas in the Velvet Room. To be honest, I like this concept a lot, and I think that Atlus deserves their flowers here for changing up one of my favorite mechanics and actually making it work. It feels like a hybrid of Soul Hacker style negotiations, but with a lot more dialogue options and personality, with each character negotiating with 4 different tactics, giving you 20 different options to choose from, which is something that I really appreciated given how much personality this gave the game. Personally, I've always loved the quirky back and forth from just about every Megaten game, and Persona 1 has its moments here, even if it is a bit of a convoluted journey to get there. It may be a little overwhelming early on, even if you're a Megaten veteran, but honestly, it's fairly easy to get the hang of things in my opinion. There are a few negotiation tools too, not all perfect, but they definitely help. Each persona has a personality summary that's highlighted when you hover over them to help you guide with your choices. Early on, personas only have 1 or 2 traits, but later on it may stack up to 4, making negotiations trickier. A mood tracker in the top left also shows whether the persona is happy, scared, angry, or eager. Your goal is to push the meter all the way to eager to get their spell card, or to happy to get an item, experience, or put your enemy under a status effect. And if things don't look like they're going in your favor, you can always switch characters mid-negotiations to try a different tactic. Personally though, I found that Nanjo was the way to go for like 70% of the personas that I ran across. So where exactly does the negotiation system trip up? The dialogue is fun, the tools are useful, there doesn't seem to be any problem. Well, negotiation is held back due to one factor, and a problem we've already discussed: leveling up. You see, it's not that difficult to actually get a demon eager to give you a spell card, but Persona 1 puts a level cap on the spell cards that you can actually get. And unlike practically all Megami Tensei games, where this cap is tied to the protagonist level only, here it's based on the average level of your party. However, just like we talked about, the uneven experience split usually drags at least one party member behind, pulling down your party's average level and limiting the spell cards you can actually negotiate for. This isn't a constant problem, especially as you progress to the later stages of the game, but you'll come across multiple times with failed negotiations due to this exact reason, and creating a lot of frustrating moments. And at the end of it, it's not that big of a deal with a bit of grinding. And given how frequent encounters are, you'll manage to overcome most level spikes pretty quick without much trouble. Well, at least the leveling up part. The combat itself, that's a whole different beast like we've already talked about. That aside, I think negotiations actually work in the game's favor. They add a quirky charm and personality that break up the frustrations from other mechanics, while also introducing the idea of spell cards in a creative, fresh way. With all of this leading to Persona 1's fusion system, opening the door to the Velvet Room and introducing Igor, 2 pieces that would become synonymous to the Persona games. Fusion in Persona 1 is probably the most straightforward and accessible mechanic in the entire game, only coming with a few minor inconveniences. The way I look at it, it does exactly what it needs to do without changing things up too much. There's nothing flashy going on here, and instead you're simply combining 2 spell cards to create a new persona, then assigning that persona to a party member who best matches its arcana. Other options like fusing 3 personas and weapons fusion, features often found in earlier Megami Tensei titles, are missing here. While I've always been a fan of both of these, I don't think their absence is necessarily a bad thing, though I surely wouldn't mind their inclusion here either. In substitute of these, Persona 1 focuses on item-based fusion, which modifies the outcome of the persona you fuse for by adding items. Depending on the item, this can increase stats, change spells, or fuse an entirely different persona. Personally, I think this brings a nice balance that makes up for some of the early frustrations with the limited number of options collecting spell cards. Even with this issue in mind, you'll eventually get enough spell cards to fuse together. That said, this also highlights the biggest downfall here, which is navigating through all the menus. Between managing personas, aligning them with the right party members, and all the different menu options, this can be a bit clunky and visually unpolished. It isn't necessarily challenging, but it's cumbersome and awkward that interferes with the flow. While not exclusive to the fusion mechanic itself, I found it to be the weakest part of this tool. Fortunately though, there is a guided fusion option to help streamline the process quite a bit. This adds to the simplicity this mechanic seems to be going for. And really, I find this simplicity to act as a major strength for the game, as it's not as overwhelming as the other mechanics we've looked at so far. One other thing I'd like to point out is that while doing some research on this game, I came across mentions of the moon phase possibly affecting fusion outcomes. For me, I've always associated the moon phase with negotiations specifically, and I'm not really sure how much influence it has on fusion itself. But in this instance, I saw it brought up quite a number of times. Thinking about it, it probably does find its way in most of the mainline Shin Megami Tensei and Persona games, and it's something I'll keep in mind for future reviews. Overall, while Persona 1's fusion system isn't groundbreaking, it's one of the more polished and enjoyable mechanics in the game. When it comes to the overworld and dungeon exploration, this is where Persona 1 feels like it's adding more by doing less. Now, I should stress this isn't a bad thing, and I actually find Persona 1 to excel here, especially with the overworld and easy navigation. Here, you'll navigate through the city from a top-down perspective, represented by an icon. Similar to Soul Hacker's overworld, everything feels much more streamlined and organized, but Persona 1 brings much more to do. Instead of one massive open space, everything is broken into districts, which keeps things easy to follow without feeling too constrained. This isn't to say there aren't a few issues found here. While I have a lot to praise about the overworld, moving around can be a bit sluggish and unstable. I ran into a few times where although I would press up, I'd move in another direction due to the position of my icon and the surrounding streets or buildings. But comparing this to a game like Shin Megami Tensei 4, where the overworld's too dark, making it hard to see obstacles and roads, this really comes off as a minor issue at most. The real struggle kicks in once you enter certain rooms that shift the camera angle to a third-person isometric view. In these cases, not only do you walk around like two pieces of chewed gum are stuck to your character, but figuring out which direction the D-pad actually goes is a pain. This doesn't really take away too much from the game, but it does make me not want to explore a few areas since I'm almost guaranteed to end up walking in circles just trying to find the door to leave. However, Persona 1's overworld stood out more to me with its variety and density of each of these sections. It's not just story-related spots, but it's also the multiple shops, healing clinics, velvet rooms, extra dungeons, people's homes, the school, and a bit more, with something always being right around the corner for you to do. This made it feel like there was a surprising amount of things to do, despite the mundane nature of most of these places, as well as the game's fairly linear structure. It's also easy to jump right back into the main task with little to no backtracking. On top of that, the atmosphere really stands out, with the overworld giving this muted dread and eerie vibe, especially when paired with the PS1's OST, also finding its way into the dungeons, working here as well. Now, when it comes to the dungeons, even though they're nothing memorable, I find them to do a lot of things right. If you've only ever played a modern Persona or SMT game, then you'll probably be a bit taken back by the dungeon crawling in Persona 1, as it sticks with the first-person, grid-based dungeon crawling found in older Shin Megami Tensei games. Now, I know it shows its age here, and the boxy environment and rough textures are still an eyesore, but they're fairly balanced and never overstay their welcome in my eyes. The dungeons themselves aren't too large, but bring the right mix of challenge and forgiveness. While the encounter rate is on the higher side, the short length of most dungeons, paired with the nearby healing spots or treasure rooms, help avoid burnout. And the puzzle mechanics you do come across are generally pretty mild, mostly being trapdoors, teleporters, or one-way paths that aren't too difficult to figure out. Even though Persona 1's dungeons aren't iconic in any sense with their design or mechanics, I still find their simplicity and balance working really well with what the rest of the game is trying to do, by letting the other systems shine while blending nicely with the overworld's clean, moody atmosphere. Now, before I get into my final thoughts, I want to highlight the differences between Persona 1 on the PlayStation and PSP, which one I recommend, as well as touch on some of the art and music direction for both. While both share the same core story and gameplay mechanics, I found the PSP version offer more and clean things up quite a bit. Its enhanced graphics, voice acting, and refined UI all create a more accessible experience. Though there's nothing wrong with the PS1's gritty, darker art style, the slightly brightened PSP version manages to keep a lot of the same atmospheric tones while still giving a stronger anime-inspired look. The character designs in the PSP feel and look a bit more expressive compared to their more subdued look in the PlayStation, yet still keep that same edgy aesthetic that identifies them. The quality and life improvements also help smooth over a lot of the rougher edges found in the PlayStation. On top of that, it also includes the Snow Queen narrative, which was cut from the original PlayStation localization. I have no idea why this would be taken out in the first place, but I'm happy to see it here. Even though it's nothing noteworthy in the grand sense of things, its addition to the PSP version makes it feel complete. Plus, you also get the original character designs, which, let's be honest, this is the way it always should have been. Gameplay-wise, enemies in the PSP feel slightly more difficult overall, but it's nothing overbearing. I've read online that the encounter rate is a bit lower, but in my opinion, it's still extremely high and not really making up for much here. Honestly, the only downfall of the PSP version is the new OST it comes with. It's clear that the PS1's OST fits better with the game's creepy tone, while the PSP gives it a more upbeat, energetic feel. While I find myself enjoying both of the soundtracks as standalones, this change ends up making it feel like you're playing two different games at times, as the PS1 leans into an eerie horror-like vibe that feels Shin Megami Tensei-like, while the PSP makes it feel more in line of an ordinary JRPG. At the end of the day, this really comes down to taste though, and both OSTs are great in my opinion, just for different reasons. If you're emulating, there's actually a patch that lets you restore the original PS1 music on the PSP version, so either option is available for you to try out. All in all, for me though, it's hard to argue against the PSP remaster. It's the more polished and complete version of Persona 1, and if you're looking to give this game a go, this is the one I recommend you playing. But with that said, let's get into my final thoughts and ranking of this game. Persona 1 delivers an old school, often frustrating experience, and while it may feel like it's creating a bad beginning, it marks a legendary start. It feels like all the core pieces are in place, but they're still raw and unpolished, with later entries in the Persona series proving just how far these ideas could go. Even so, the game still shines in some areas, and I personally was left enjoying Persona 1 more than I expected due to its narrative, characters, and atmosphere. And though I did walk away with some good notes, it's also hard to ignore the issues this game comes with. The gameplay, while ambitious, is really messy, and it doesn't hit the mark developers likely intended. Its clunky systems and overly complicated mechanics are a major hurdle, and they'll definitely be a turnoff for fans coming from the modern Persona games. But its short playtime does make these manageable, kind of like there's a light at the end of the tunnel. And because of that, Persona 1 gets a light recommendation for me. I think for those curious about the origins of the series will find value in giving Persona 1 a shot. It's far from my favorite entry, but it's also not my least favorite. As for its placement in the series, Persona 1 lands firmly in the C tier. Much like Shin Megami Tensei 1, it felt like a game laying the groundwork, but still rough around the edges. And if hearing my full thoughts on Shin Megami Tensei 1 is something you're interested in, click the link on the screen to check out my full review there. And of course, I'd love to hear what you think about Persona 1, or the series in general. So drop your thoughts down in the comments below, and I'll forever be at your service.